Trade tensions between the U.S. and China are escalating today. President Trump has threatened to impose new tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. China's top trade negotiator will be in Washington this week for talks. The latest tensions have already had a negative impact on global markets, especially for farmers. Wall Street Journal reporter Lingling Wei is following the very latest from Beijing. Let us dive into it, Lingling. So the president's top trade negotiator, Robert Lighthouser, he accuses China of walking back specific commitments or reneging on specific commitments that were made before. What caused these talks to break down?
Sure. Glad to be here on this show. One sticking point that caused the talks to break down, as we understand it, is does involve the enforcement mechanism. So the U.S. side wanted the Chinese side to lay out in the trade agreement specific laws and regulations China is going to change in order to honor its commitment. But China is balking at this kind of request because they view that as a violation of its sovereignty.
So they want to agree to sort of a general list of agreements. Yes, we will do X, Y, Z. The Americans want to know specifically what statutes will you rewrite to ensure that you comply with your promises, basically.
Exactly. China agreed to some broader language about structural changes, right, as part of the agreement. But the U.S. said, no, we want more details.
So now we know that Chinese officials will be coming to the U.S. on Thursday, but these new round of sanctions are scheduled to kick in the very next day. What's the likelihood that any sort of deal can be hammered out in time to halt these new sanctions? Tariffs, rather, not sanctions.
I guess we're about to find out very soon whether or not this kind of tariff threat will lead to a more productive deal or full breakdown in negotiations. I think the very encouraging sign that China sent out overnight, New York Times, was that they are still sending Liu He to Washington for the talks, because initially, right after the tweets from President Trump about this new tariff hikes, China was considering canceling the talks because their principle has always been not to negotiate on the threat. But now it does seem like there's a change of mind, that they're still sending their top trade envoy to Washington. That shows that Beijing is eager to get the deal done.
Yeah, certainly it seems like part of President Trump's negotiating strategy, and we've seen him do this when it comes to a number of trade deals, is to, threaten to pull out, really sort of hardline, aggressive language. And, as an outsider, you sort of wonder as you watch him if this is part of the negotiating strategy, threaten the absolute worst in the hopes that the person you're negotiating with will sort of meet you in the middle. But you write something really interesting in your latest article about Chinese officials saying that turning the heat on China would only lead to rising nationalist sentiment. It's really not conducive, or conductive rather, to reaching a deal, conducive to reaching a deal. Does China not respond to this sort of hardline strategy?
Well, that's a great question. So far, the hardline sentiment in China has been rising, actually, ever since the U.S. side handed the Chinese side a list of requests last May. So a lot of people in China, not just in the official circle, but ordinary Chinese, are seeing this trade offensive from Washington as a sign that the U.S. is trying to bring down China. So this kind of hawkish, nationalistic sentiment definitely is rising in China. So for someone like Liu He, who is the well-known reformer in China, who does believe in economic liberalization, so he faced a very big challenge of, trying to cut a deal with the U.S. without being seen as caving to Washington. So that's a very big balancing act he has to walk over so far.
So, Lingling, you mentioned that the Chinese certainly considered pulling out of these negotiations altogether, but they're not doing that. They're sending representatives to the U.S. What's at stake for Xi Jinping?
the stake is quite high. Obviously, Xi Jinping wants a deal, arguably, probably even more so than President Trump, because a lot of stakes are here for him. For example, Chinese economy just stabilized in the first quarter of this year at a very heavy cost. The government basically dialed back Xi's initial, previous initiatives like debt control and pollution control. So they really launched aggressive stimulus measures to steady growth. So a full-blown trade war would risk further declines in China's economy and potentially cause political instability in China.
Fascinating. Lingling Wei, thank you so much.
Sure.